Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the 2022 Virtual Flower Show. This is the third year that it's been running and gets better and better every year. And what we're going to do for the next session is answer some of your gardening questions. And we're very lucky that we've got before us a set of talented horticulturists from around the UK. They're all specialists in their own field. You've probably seen them if you've been to the big, the flower shows that you can go to, the real flower shows. This is a real flower show, but it's virtual, of course. You'll see that they create some wonderful exhibits. So we've got all these RHS Gold winning, award-winning exhibitors with us today. So just to introduce them before we take the questions, we've got, in no particular order, we've got Lynne Dibley from Dibleys Nursery there. Hello, Lynne. Nice to see the Streptocarpus there behind you. We've got Matt Soper from down at Hampshire Carnivorous Plants. Grows a fantastic
morning.
collection. Hi, Matt. Rosy Hardy, we've got with us from Hardy's Cottage Garden Plants, also down.
Hello there.
Hi, Rosy. Steve Hickman in Yorkshire, agapanthus, tall baggias and clivias. And then last but by no means least, we've got Mel Collins from Mickfield, Hostas, Hosta specialist extraordinaire. So thank you for joining us today. I've got some questions that have been sent in. So there's some questions for all of you, so we will get round. But please, even if the question is on your subject, then please feel free to chip in. All right, Steve, everything okay?
Yeah.
Marvellous, that's good. Keep them quiet, that's what I say. So first one, this one is going to be for you, Matt. This is a question on saracenia, which I know you specialise in. In fact, I was with your nursery only earlier this week, and you've got some fantastic plants there coming on for the shows. So this one is, why won't my saracenia flower? And I can actually ask that one myself, because I've had one in a pot now for a number of years, and I can't get mine to flower. So what's the trick in getting them to flower?
Firstly, the plants have to be 5 to 6 years old before they will flower. So they mature at 5 to 6 years old. Your one, by the sounds of it, Martin, hasn't flowered. It could be. Well, I find here, the more insects material they catch the following year, then you'll get decent flowers on them. If they aren't catching that much insect-wise, then they don't build up the strength to produce the flowers the following year. So those are one of the two I would think would be the problem. But saying that, I do have plants here on the nursery that sometimes don't flower for 6 or 7 years. I don't think there are any hard and fast rules apart from the age of the plant and whether it's caught a lot of insect material the year before. So look at those two things first, I would think.
Okay, and what about pot size? I mean, mine is in about a 6-inch pot. It was in a smaller one when I got it. I potted up into the mix, and it grows and it makes pictures, maybe a good foot tall. But do you think maybe after the time I've had it, I should be going into a bigger pot to give it a bigger root run?
Yeah, don't be tempted with that. Big pots don't make big plants with saracenia. They really like to be restricted and pushing right up against the side of the pot. We always use plastic pots because we find that terracotta can sometimes release salts into the compost, which can upset the plant. So try and always use plastic. If you want to use terracotta, make sure it's glazed or line it with a polythene liner. If you do put them in big pots, they get a bit lost. They just tend to put a lot of root down rather than top growth. So keep them undersized potted is the best thing with saracenia for sure.
Yeah, and obviously no feeding with any.
Never feed them.
Never feed.
No.
And rain.
I mean, one thing, I would say if you're growing yours inside, Martin, you haven't been catching much insect material, pop it out July, August time, and they'll catch plenty by themselves. Don't be tempted to put flies into them. Just pop them outside July, August, and they'll catch plenty of insect material to produce the flowers the following year.
Okay, good, right, okay. So hope that whoever that question was from their flowers as well. I'm going to try and get mine into flowers this year and take a photograph and send it to you, Matt. Right, Streptocarpus question here for Lynne. I've had a Streptocarpus that hasn't flowered yet this year. It flowered and flowered all last summer. Do you think it's flowered itself out and won't come back? Oh dear, hope not. Lynne?
No, I mean, that's the good thing with Streptocarpus. They will just carry on. They will sort of... as long as you keep feeding them a high potash feed from about March through to September, October time. But if it flowered all last year, so it's coming into its maybe second or third season, it might need repotting. Just check that the roots aren't too tight in the pot. If there's a lot of root coming through the drainage holes at the bottom, repotting just a slightly larger pot, good houseplant compost, and that will encourage the extra feed, and that compost will encourage the plant to come back into flower. There's no such thing as sort of the burnout in effect with plants, with the Streptocarpus. They will flower, but they just need the feed to get them into flower.
And I suppose, like lots of other plants, they need a rest, don't they? If they've flowered for a long time, they have a semi-dormant period where, I suppose in the wild, they don't flower 12 months of the year, do they? They have a rest period.
Yeah, I mean, that's right. I mean, through the winter time, the light levels aren't strong enough for them to sort of bring the plants into flower generally, for the most of them. But yeah, a lot of it comes down to the energy they're getting from the light and the feed and the compost.
Okay, so fingers crossed it will be flowering later on. A few months' time, you'll have wonderful flowers on there again. So a slug question here relating to hostas now, Mel.
What a surprise.
Yeah, what a surprise, isn't it? It's one that pops up all the time, but it's always going to be there. Somebody wants to know, what is the best way to prevent slug and snail damage on hostas?
Well, the main thing to understand really is the fact that it's predominantly snails that do the damage rather than slugs. The slugs tend to get the blame because they're silly enough to be lying around looking fat and satisfied during the day, so they tend to get the blame, where the snails come out at night and have a feed, and then you can't find the culprits during the day. The best thing I've found more recently is to try, if you can't find the snail or the slug that's actually started to cause damage to your plant, is to try and hunt down the snail trail. Now, these mollusks, they lay a trail. They use an awful lot of energy in order to do it. But the prime reason for them to lay that trail is for ease of getting about, because naturally they haven't got legs. They're relying on an easier journey. But it acts a bit like an ant pheromone trail, and it helps them navigate their way back to your plant. So the most important thing to do is, when you spot damage to your plant, is to act fairly quickly and try and eradicate any snail trails that you find. Now, if they're growing in pots, just wipe the sides of the pots and the area around. If they're in the ground, just disturb the soil all around the plant. And quite often you'll be successful in destroying that trail enough to put them off coming back. I've found it works really, really well. I do use pellets occasionally if I have a bad year. I don't tend to do it every year, because I think if you can just keep on top of the population in your garden, then you're doing quite well. But the secret to using pellets is to keep them dry. Keep them dry keeps them active. So I tend to use little jars, put a few in a jar, lay the jar on its side, and think like a snail, where would I hide in the heat of the day? And that's where you pop the jars. Water works really well. If you're growing them in pots, what's really good for the plant as well is to put the pot in a shallow dish or tray. It doesn't have to be very deep. And what you do is you keep that filled up with water throughout the season. And that allows the plant to take up all the moisture it needs. It's watering it from the bottom, so it tends to encourage the roots to come down and build a good, strong plant. And it's a natural barrier against snails. They need air to breathe, so they can't cross a water barrier particularly easily. It doesn't stop the airborne division, but you know, that's life. And sometimes they'll come in off other things. Birds can drop them and all that sort of thing. But the key really is to, if you spot the damage, act fairly quickly. And don't forget, don't just look down if you're trying to find the snails, look up as well, as we found 3 dozen hiding in some clematis last year in our garden. I don't expect to have much trouble this year.
Okay, so the secret is then really get onto the case early, because once they've done the damage to the leaf, then that's irreversible, isn't it? It's there.
Well, yes, I mean, they'll just keep coming back. That's why sometimes it looks like you've got a sacrificial hosta. You'll have several growing, and people always ask me, why does it only eat this one? It's because it's probably laid that trail back to the plant and it just keeps returning. So like I say, eradicate the trail and you might eradicate the problem.
Right. And while we're on the subject of slugs and snails, because it is a big problem, anybody else got any tips on how they control them? I mean, Rosy, you go herbaceous, which are prime subjects, aren't they, for slugs and snails?
Yeah, they are, but I mean, the same, you know, sort of I always advocate putting a few pellets into a jar as well. And I always say to people, use a jar that's square, because then when you put it down on the ground, it doesn't roll away anywhere. And, you know, mango chutney jars are brilliant because they're nice and long. So
I use.
yeah, so they're really good. And then I always say to people, have a special spoon that you use for it. So, you know, so a latte spoon, so you can put it in to there without you actually touching the pellets. So you're just sensible for people to do that. And one or two of my customers have said, oh, it's amazing. It's like this massive trap. And they have to go and, you know, get rid of all the snails and slugs that are actually inside the jar. But I said, well, if you're catching them and getting rid of them, then that's really good. I think, you know, people who keep chickens are always lucky because that helps. But then you have the problem that the chickens scratch around on the rest of the borders and doesn't help too much. But they are very, very good at finding any pests, you know, not just snails, but anything else that's in the garden. Otherwise, yeah, it's just looking out. It's just checking to make sure that there's nothing there. And if you find the eggs, make sure you destroy the eggs, especially in container grown material that's sitting at the back door or at the front door. And people are doing a lot more container planting now. So you've got to remember to regularly repot. And when you regularly repot, you will get rid of a lot of the snail eggs that are in your containers. And lifting your containers and checking underneath, because that's another place they love to hide.
Okay, lovely. More tips there. That's great. Steve, one for you. This is about clivia, which I know you've got a big collection of and specialise in. And how can I encourage my clivia? This is not me, by the way, because you can see my clivia behind me is in full flower. But this is a question from somebody who wants to know how to encourage their clivia to flower.
That's probably one of the most common questions that we get. Easily answered. Clivias need a cold period in the autumn for the bud to set in the bottom of the plant. I'll just show you this one. This one just here. The buds are formed right in the base of the leaves early on, well, really early on in the year, but to stimulate the bud, it must have a cold period of less than 10 degrees in the autumn. So October, November is ideal. So put your clivias outside in a shady spot. Bring them in obviously before the frosts. Keep them dry over winter, which is the natural rest period, and then start watering and feeding every fortnight from, say, about mid-January, February. The feed is quite important. A decent general houseplant food is okay. And the feed stimulates the flower to come up on a stem. If you don't feed the plant, but the bud has been initiated, it will flower, but the flower will be in the leaf canopy here. It'll not be extended above the leaves, which is what you want to see the flower. Carry on feeding every 2 weeks right through the season. If you're in a warm room, the clivias will flower sort of January, February time. If you're in a cool room, then they'll flower sort of later in the season. We've got fans on 24 hours a day, keeping ours cool. We don't start watering and feeding ours, I think it was about 3 weeks ago I started, because we kind of keep them later for Chelsea. So the more I can, you know, keep off watering and cooler, the later they will flower through the year. We've even had them flower in middle of June for the Chatsworth show, and that used to run. So that's the tip on flowering clivia every year. Keep them pot bound. They do like to be tight in the pots. Amarella daisy, like the agapanthus, and it's as easy as that.
Okay, you make it look so easy. So, well, hopefully that works. Whoever sent that question. Back to Rosy. This is a question from somebody that doesn't have a garden, but they would still like to grow a few perennials in a container, always to make like a little mini herbaceous border in, I would think, a reasonably large container. So could you recommend a few plants that would be suitable for going in a container? Probably aren't going to be too tall, obviously, that are compact, but would just give that a feeling of a little mini herbaceous border in a large pot.
Yeah, I mean, there are quite a few different herbaceous plants that were quite happy to be in smaller containers. So you can you've got to decide what size your container is first of all. And I would say if you're going to use more alpine size herbaceous, so such as some of the armerias, some of the small campanulas and pulsatilas, those sorts of things. And always choose things that like the same conditions. So those would all like a sunny spot. Or you can choose something for a shadier spot, and you can add in, you know, if you're going to the shadier spot, then you can use some of the dwarf hostas along with corydalus, maybe add in a fern if it's a shady area. But then if you're wanting something that's really flowery and exuberant, then you probably need a slightly larger container. So something that is probably 45 centimeters across, I would say, would be minimum, and then probably something like 5 plants in there. You could utilize geum because they flower all the year round, so something like geum scarlet tempest, really bright and flamboyant. You could add a small grass in there to give you some height, so something like Stipa tenuissima gets really nice and flowing and isn't too big. It's not going to take up too much space in itself. Dianthus are always good in a container as well. You could mix something in there. So good old favorite like Doris or something, because they give you a lovely perfume, and you can make it as wacky colored as you want, you know. So I would add maybe a yellow daisy in there, especially for early on. So something like Doronicum excelsum harper crew would mix in quite nicely with that, and all of those would go in reasonable spot. But if you're going to do it, make sure that you've got a good compost in there. And the sort of compost I would use is something like the Melcourts with added John Innes, because that's really, really good for the containers for the herbaceous stuff. And that way, all you've got to remember is the watering. Watering is key. If you can get a big saucer underneath and use water from underneath, that's very good. But remember that the majority of potting media's compost will always look dry on the top, and that's where people go wrong when they're container growing. They think it's dry, so they water, they overwater, and of course the plants then can't swim and they end up dying, unfortunately, because people tend to overwater when they container grow.
Okay, right, lots of plants there. I mean, I suppose basically anything, isn't it? It's you can grow pretty much anything in a pot as long as you water it and feed it, and it's got enough room to grow, so you can still have a little mini herbaceous garden in containers. So good luck with that. Right, back to Lynne here. Lynne, this is from a lady that's been given a begonia rex plant as a gift from a friend. She's never grown one before and just wants a few tips on how to keep it healthy. She doesn't want it to die for when a friend comes to visit.
The main thing with begonia rex is they don't like hot sunlight. So they're good on a north-facing windowsill. Don't want to be too cold at night time though, so be careful that it's not in a too cool a room. They like about minimum 15, 16 degrees centigrade. And then they'll go up to about 25 degrees centigrade. So it's the sunlight they don't like, and they do like a little bit of humidity as well. So if they're in a bathroom, that's an ideal spot for them. The humidity in the air keeps the leaves looking really nice and fresh. If it's too dry, they tend to go a little bit crispy around the outside. So in a bathroom, in a light situation, but not direct sunshine. If you haven't got somewhere like that, then put a gravel tray underneath that's got some water. And as that water evaporates around the plant, it just keeps a bit more humidity. So that will help the leaves. But generally, with plants like begonia rexes, like a lot of house plants, once you move them from one situation to another, they take a couple of weeks just to get acclimatized. So put them in a spot that you sort of think is going to be suitable, and then give them 2 weeks and see how they're doing then, and then have another reappraisal. And then also just keep them on the slightly dry side. They don't like too much water around the roots either.
Okay, so warmth is the thing. I mean, lots of plants will stand it cool, but obviously this one, even in the winter, still needs that sort of living room temperature. Don't put it in a cold conservatory or anything like that, by the sound of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. But when with a lot of houseplants, when they go into a cool situation, they're not using the water. So generally they need a lot less water in the winter time.
Okay, all right, thanks, Lynn. Right, back to Matt. Another one here, partly linked to the first question, so it's a two-parter. This is from somebody else, but I should have pulled it in with the first question. Will flowering kill a carnivorous plant? So when it flowers, does it die?
For the majority of them, no. I mean, they have to flower to reproduce, but we do find that Dinia muscipula, the Venus flytrap, produces a rather large flower for the size of the plant, and they'll flower at 3 years. And when they're 3 years old, they're about 3 or 4 inches across, about 10-12 centimeters across. That can really weaken the plant. The flower scape is about 4 foot tall, 30 centimeters. So once it gets to about 3 or 4 inches or about 10 centimeters, cut it off. Then you'll put more energy into the plant and produce more traps, which is what you want the Venus flytrap to produce rather than the flower. Once the plant reaches about 5 or 6 years old, you can allow it to flower and you could pollinate it and produce your own seed. But for a Venus flytrap, this is the main one we're talking about really, is it's best to remove the flowers, yes, when they start to form. Saracenia, Drosera, all the others, you can allow them to flower if you like them. The only time I would remove the flowers on Saracenia is if they're getting in the way of emerging pitches or leaves which are being produced. So other than that, everything else can flower apart from the Venus flytrap.
I mean, the Saracenia flowers are amazing, aren't they, on these long, tall stems? And I think people use them for cut flower, don't they, now?
Yeah, they're fantastic. They look great. I mean, we're fortunate to have a group of plants which have spectacular foliage and flowers. So we've got the best of both worlds with them. So it's entirely up to you. If you like the foliage, remove the flowers. I mean, by all means, let them flower in the spring, then remove the flowers and let the foliage come up, because the flowers always come up before the foliage with the majority of the carnivorous plants.
Right, that's good. But the main question, that was a bit of a digression, was...
Sorry, yeah.
Any carnivorous plants be grown outside permanently all through the year?
Yeah, we did a trial with the RHS on the nursery. We had North American pitcher plants, Saracenia, growing outside for 4 years. They do exceptionally well where we are down here in Hampshire. All species survive. Some really, really thrive, and we've got them growing outside now ourselves after conducting the trial. And a few varieties, Purpurea, Saracenia flava, will grow anywhere in the UK. They're bulletproof. Yeah, definitely.
And anybody thinking, oh, well, you know, Matt's Nurseries down in the south in Hampshire, you get pretty cold winters where you are, don't you?
Yeah, we get pretty cold winters. We've got to bear in mind that Saracenia purpurea comes from Nova Scotia in Canada, and it gets pretty cold there. It goes down to about -25 sometimes. So if you use that as a parent and cross with some of the other ones that are from the southern states, you can breed hardiness into them. They're hardy, Martin. They really are. Yeah.
Okay, that's good. Well, I might have a go at that myself in North Yorkshire. I think you're going to have a go, aren't you, Steve, in Yorkshire where you are? Mel, another hosta question. This time it's from somebody that's got an established hosta in their garden, but they need to move it. They're having some building work done and it's got to be lifted now. It's only got new growth a couple of inches tall. They want to know, is it too late? Well, they've got to move it, but is it worth doing and will it survive even though it's started into growth?
No, don't worry about that. It's fine. It will survive. We had to replace the roof on the bungalow a few years back, and we couldn't move it because we couldn't find where they all were. And we stood scaffolding and tiles and everything on them, and up they popped in the spring. The key thing is, if it was over winter, I say don't move it. Just put something flat on the ground to take the pressure off, so you don't actually pierce the ground and get to the shoots or anything. But as moving it now, absolutely fine. I'd say have your 3 or 4 shredded wheat in the morning, or delegate the job if it's nicely big and established. But dig a decent size area around it and move it like you would most other things, and it should absolutely be fine. So go for it.
Okay, that's brilliant. Okay, Steve, this one's an agapanthus question, which is your big speciality. How big a pot do you need, and how long can you keep agapanthus in a container, and so that they'll flourish and keep flowering?
Right, if you buy agapanthus in a 9 centimetre pot, a 3-inch container. You can put that in a 3-litre container, about a 6-inch pot, and it'll be happy on its own for about 2 years without repotting. Well-drained compost is a norm. If you want to put 3 9 centimetres together, you'll use a 30 centimetre, a foot diameter pot, put all 3 together, and again for 2 years they're perfectly okay. They'll get pot bound quick and they'll flower. Alternatively, if you buy say a 2 or a 3 litre agapanthus, one of those in a 12-inch pot for 2 years. But you must remember after 2 years to pot them on in a slightly larger pot, and then another 2 years in a slightly larger pot. Don't leave them in the same pot for too many years, otherwise the height of the flower will diminish, the number of flowers you get will diminish, and eventually the plant will stop flowering altogether. So although it's a benefit to pot them initially and get them root bound to flower, it's not a benefit to leave them in that same pot for a long time like some people suggest you do. And obviously feed them regular from spring to
It is
autumn.
often suggested, isn't it, that the more pot bound they are, the better they flower, but that isn't the case. They can get too pot bound and the root gets so restricted. If you can't go into a bigger pot physically, you haven't got room for one, what's the solution? Do you take it out and just divide it and replant it?
Yeah, in springtime, I mean, this is the time to do it, mid-March, mid-April time before they start to grow. If you've got one already in sort of half a beer barrel size container, then take it out. You can chop it with a spade straight down the centre, put the flat parts on the ground, chop those straight down the centre. Any damaged roots or growing points, discard. Leave it while the next day before repotting it or replanting it in your garden, which you can do, because where you cut, the sap will come out of the thick rhizome, and the next day that's healed. So if it's overwatered or it rains for a fortnight, the plant's not going to rot. And off you go again. Or in a pot, if you divide it up, you can go into smaller pots. So that gets rid of your problem.
Okay, jolly good. Thank you for that one. Right, Rosy, this one again on herbaceous perennials. Somebody would like to know if you know any that are fairly strong growing with strong stout stems that don't need supporting. So, very often we put frames around perennials or canes and string or twiggy sticks, but somebody wants to grow some that will stand on their own without having to support them. Do they exist? Are there any that you don't need to support?
A lot of people worry about the supporting of plants, don't they? And really, a lot of problem is that people are overfeeding the herbaceous borders and the plants become soft. So the softer they are, the more they fall over, the taller they get. So one thing to start off with is try and be a little bit less free and easy with all of the food that you're putting on. So herbaceous borders, yes, you can mulch it in the autumn or in the spring, depending on which you do, but don't give it anything. Don't give them chicken feed. That's the worst thing that people can do to herbaceous plants, because they just suddenly go, wow, nitrogen, we're just going to grow, and they put on loads and loads of leaf. They go really, really tall, they get really soft, and then they fall over. So that's the first thing. So don't overfeed them, and they will stay shorter, they will be stronger. But anything that has got a square stem, so all of the salvia family, all of the lamiaceae, they all have square stems. So they've got natural girders already that they produce from the point of view of how the stem is formed. So things like Salvia caradonna, which gets quite tall, won't collapse over. Some of the shrubby type of salvia, so things like Salvia hot lips or amethyst lips, all of those are already sub-shrubby, so they're holding themselves quite well upright. So from the point of view of requiring staking, I would say most perennials don't actually need it if you are growing them in the right conditions. So a lot of the reason that they collapse or do that is due to the way that they're being grown, more than the plant needing to actually be staked. The other thing that does help is Chelsea chop. or chopping back at a certain time. Usually it's done end of May, and that means taking the plants, so the plants will already have grown up and be somewhere around about 30 centimetres high. You chop them right the way down, almost to ground level, to about 2 inches, 5 centimetres, and from the ground, and that checks the plant's growth. And then they'll go up, and the second lot of stems that go up don't get as tall, don't collapse, and they'll be absolutely fine. There are other plants such as veronicastrums, which are really tall, so they'll get up to 1,50 meters. They don't need staking. They've got good, strong stems. So there are ones there that, you know, I mean, we don't stake anything that we grow on the nursery. They all stay without stakes, so they're all perfectly fine because we don't give them too much food. So they have a little bit of slow release fertilizer and they just have what they require. So that's the key thing, I think, really, to growing them well in a herbaceous border is not overfeeding.
Okay, lovely, thanks for that. Right, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we've got a few questions, a few general ones, and I might even ask you for a little tip if we've got time. So think of a quick fire tip. Another one for Lynne. This is from somebody that wants to encourage their young children. I think these are adult children, but they're not little children, to grow a few houseplants. So a couple of suggestions for something that's easy to get started with, please, Lynne.
Well, I suppose one of the easiest is spider plants, chlorophytum. It takes a lot of abuse, yeah. Exactly, and it's fun because it will, even if you overwater it, it will carry on growing a little bit slower, but you know, it will get, you know, recover from abuse, and it produces these lovely plantlets on long stems off the side, and then you can repropagate and restart again. They produce their own roots, so you've got the foliage at the top, and they produce more roots. So for the children, it's great. You can pot them up, see them growing, and that is one of the easiest plants to get started and get growing with.
And it's one of the best, I think, isn't it, for sort of taking, you know, sort of pollutants out of the atmosphere, isn't it? You know, that's why it's often used in offices. It helps to clean the air. So that's really right. Good.
Yeah, amongst sort of one of the top 10 plants, house plants that was found to sort of do that. And I think that was a NASA experiment many years ago to try and keep the air clean in spaceships. So that was what they were doing for that for.
Okay, so all those people with a spaceship, you need some of these, definitely. Right, Matt, we touched on this at the beginning when we asked about saracenias flowering, and you were saying the answer isn't always to go into a big pot, but if you do need to repot your saracenias or any carnivorous plant, what is the best time of the year to do it?
The best time for the majority of the plants is February, March, just as the crowns start to open a bit. So quite early in the year. You can pot on carefully later on in the year, as long as you really rehydrate them or stand them in quite deep trays of rainwater. That includes Venus flytrap, sundews and saracenia. You've got to remember that these plants actually stand in water, so it's not a case of watering now and then. You actually stand the pot with perforated holes in the bottom of the pot in a tray or a deep saucer of rainwater to rehydrate them. So, but the time for repotting, February, March for sure is the best time.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Now, are there any hostas that will not be eaten by snails?
No. That's your honest answer. I would always, if you've got a bad snail problem, whilst you're trying to get on top of that, some of the modern cultivars have been bred with extra sets of chromosomes, so the tetraploid varieties, varieties that have got good tough leaves to them. If you just feel the leaf and think to yourself, well, you know, it would take quite a bit to get through that. There are some good ones that have got a blue bloom. So when you see blue in a hosta, it's a bloom on the surface of the leaf, and for some reason or other they're less likely to be munched. So I would say good old varieties like June, Devon Green, big strong butch varieties like Big Daddy and things like that are always good choices if you've got a bad snail problem. But again, you've got to do something about those snails. You do need them in the garden, but you just don't need so many. They're eating all the things they shouldn't be.
Exactly. It's getting that balance, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Steve, marine bulbs. These obviously aren't going to flower now until what, sort of September, October, but it's the time to plant them. How do you plant marine bulbs?
Right, very easy. You want a sunny position. You want a well-drained soil or compost. And when you plant them, they must have the nose of the bulb out of the compost. Do not plant them deep, otherwise it's a no-no. The earlier in the season you plant the bulbs, then the more chance you get flowering the first year of planting, especially if you buy the first grade bulbs, which are the big ones. And not the ones on a special offer in a plastic bag, 25 for a fiver. You'll not live long enough to see them flower. Well, at least I won't. Feed them a good potash feed to encourage the bulbs, and they just get better and better every year. If you can put them in containers, but don't let the container dry out. And we suggest probably in a 12-inch pot, probably about half a dozen nereims. If you're going in your garden, then it's up to the distances. But if you work on about half a dozen in that sort of area, you can't go far wrong. So sunny position, well drained, don't let them dry out in a container, and you've cracked it.
Okay, and very quickly, last one from you, because it's a tall baggia, which is one of the plants you grow. When is the best time to divide those? Because they make a clump like chives, don't they, really?
They do. Best time to do to a baggia is springtime, before they start to grow. If it's in your garden, dig it up, knock it gently to get rid of as much soil as you can. If it's in a container, then take it out of its container. Again, knock it gently around to get rid of as much compost as you can. Any dead roots will fall off, and you'll be able to see the actual little rhizomes. If you go around with your thumbs together and feel around the edge, because there'll be probably a couple of dozen shoots, you'll feel the way in. And if you shove your thumbs in, you'll be able to prise the plant apart. You'll hear some snapping noises, but that's fine. Open it up, and you've got to get your thumbs again, feel around it, put your thumbs in and split it again. You've got 4. Depending how many you want, you could split it down into individual shoots, which have 2 growing points on per shoot, which is what we do, and then we pot them into the 9-centimetre pots for sale later. Again, they need a well-drained compost, feed them a good high potash feed, and the splits should flower the same year of splitting. And it's very simple. You need to split them every 3 years to keep the plant in a juvenile frame of mind, and you get loads of flowers. If you leave it in the same pot or just pot it on gradually like you do agapanthus, it'll eventually stop flowering altogether, and you'll just have a
good tip, because they are amazing. They'll start running from May till September.
Oh yeah. The best one is probably one called Pink Beauty. That's the one we bred last year, and it flowers. It's the best flowering tubergia you can get. It's marvellous.
Where would you get that from?
I think Hoyland Plant Centre might have some. You'll see them at the Harrogate Spring Show next week.
Right, jolly good. We've got 3 sort of general questions we'll do very quickly, and then I am going to ask you if you just got a very quick top tip for this time of the year, or anything you want to say, just a few seconds. So anybody can answer these. First one is it too late to cut back my dogwood shrubs, the ones that we grow for the lovely stem colours? Any of you grow dogwoods?
It's a little bit late for cutting them back. They should be done in the autumn, really. But if you've got a large one that's getting very woody at the base, then go for it. I would. I'm always keen to cut things down if they're getting out of control and not looking good. So yeah, it would be normally, as I say, it would be done normally in the autumn, but or early spring.
Yeah, I can say I do mine early spring, because then I get the beauty of the stems. But I do mine every year, so I'm not cutting thick branches. I'm cutting sort of finger thick 1 year's growth. So I really like to do mine early March, because by now they're actually starting to bud and make new growth. But
they are. I mean, mine are all putting off beautiful leaf now at the moment. So it is a little bit late, and mine are quite young plants. So this coming autumn or next spring, whenever I remember, they will get cut back down. But you do see a lot of them on the roadsides where they've just been used as hedging, and they don't look as good because all that happens is that they get cut off with the hedge cutter at around about 60 centimetres. And so you don't get that beautiful new growth from the base, you just get a bit at the top. And if you've got one a little bit like that in the garden, you need to go back down. They will send new shoots up and you'll get those lovely coloured stems.
I think we should make it against the law to trim dogwoods with a hedge cutter. It's criminal. Somebody's planted some snowdrops in the lawn last year and they haven't flowered. Why? Well, I think it's probably because they were small bulbs, and they do take sometimes a year or two to settle in, don't they? So I would say on that one, just be patient, let them die down, and hopefully next year we'll get flowers. And the last one, before we get your quick tips or anything you want to mention, this one is somebody's got a hardy fuchsia in the garden which is growing over other plants. Can it be cut back or should it be removed? Because it depends how big it grows, but you can cut fuchsias back hard every year. You could do that now. You could cut them back into old wood and you'll just get a flush of new growth that will flower this year and it won't get as big. Some of these,
yes, I mean, I would always say cut them right down to the ground level and let the new growth come through. But you can always thin, summer prune them and get growth out of the way if it's going over other things, because you can train them to however you want them to be. So I think, you know, allowing it to go over, just cut it back. You're not going to kill the plant.
No, absolutely. So that's all the questions done. So if I just go around you now as you are on my screen. So Lynn, any little top tip, just a quick tip you want to mention?
Just keep an eye out for pests and diseases this time of the year, especially it's sort of, we first start seeing things like aphid appearing on plants, and they go for the young growth. So look at the crown of the plants where the flowers, buds are, where the young leaves are, underneath the leaves, and as soon as you see aphid, just squeeze them away. Get whatever you use against aphid, use it. And most sprays you're going to find in the garden centre for aphid, they are a contact spray. So you need to spray and actually touch the aphid with the spray. Otherwise it won't work. So spray all over the plant and including underneath the plant, the leaves of the plants.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Mel?
Right, we're getting into the time of year where you can happily divide your hostas, and I've just, for your delectation, written a newsletter on division. So if you've got any questions regarding dividing your hostas, then take a look on our website. It's linked from the home page because it's the newest newsletter, and go for it. It's very simple.
Okay, that's good, lovely. Matt?
Yeah, if you're growing temperate carnivorous plants, by that I mean saracenia, Venus flytraps and sundews, they're all coming into their full spring growth now. You cannot overwater the plants. They need to be very, very well hydrated. Never ever let the plants dry out at this time of year, because you're going to spoil all the growth that's going to come on later in the season. If you want to see more about this, we've got this on our YouTube channel at the moment. It is very, very important watering at this time of year. So that's a really good tip.
Okay, lovely. And Rosy?
Yeah, I think watch out for frost damage on the herbaceous that's just coming through at the moment. Last week we had -5.4, and a lot of the new young growth is now black. So, you know, and a lot of people are asking us now, what does frost damage look like? And a lot of plant material, the leaves looked brilliant, they're now going brown, they'll go black. Cut all the frost damage stuff off so that new growth can come through. I think that's the key thing at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Rosie. And Steve?
Yeah, well, this is the absolute best time of year for repotting your agapanthus or your tubagia and splitting. But one of the most important things, this is the time of year to start feeding agapanthus and tubagia every fortnight right up to the end of September. This is the key time of year for doing this. Any later in the season for splitting and repotting agapanthus, and you're going to affect flowering this year. We recommend a good high potash feed, and we find that we use the Hoyland Plant Centre feed, and it's absolutely terrific.
Marvellous. I expect nothing less. So thank you to everybody for for joining us today to answer these questions. And my tip would be to everybody is, support these British independent growers and either through their websites, their nurseries, or visit them at flower shows and see the fantastic displays that they all create. Buy lots of plants and enjoy your garden. And if you want lots of gardening tips, I'm just going to get my little plug in now. I do a weekly gardening video that goes out on Facebook and on YouTube. It's called Pots and Trowels. And each week we do something, could be vegetable garden, houseplants, lawns, fruit, vegetables, you name it, we do something different. So that's Pots and Trowels on YouTube and Facebook. So thank you very much for listening, and we hope to see you at one of the shows later on in the year. Bye. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye.